How did Aeneas escape the destruction of Troy? How did he travel to Italy and found the city of Rome? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about today on this channel. I'm your host, Teresa, and this is Legends of the Founding. Let's start with a refresher on where we are. In the late Bronze Age, around 1200 BC, the great city of Troy was destroyed by invaders from Greece, but there was one Trojan hero who escaped. His name was Aeneas, and he fled to Italy where he became the ancestor of Romulus and Remus, the legendary founders of Rome. Or did he? What really happened? Let's find out. There are two ways to tell the story of how Aeneas got to Italy, and both versions were popular in ancient Rome. One version was laid out in Book 1 of the Aeneid, which was written by Virgil at the request of Augustus and published sometime between 29 and 19 BC. This was the official story, and it was very important to Augustus because he was a descendant of Aeneas. So if he could trace his lineage back to a god, it would increase his divine right to rule. So let us go over how Aeneas escaped from Troy and made his way to Italy according to Virgil. Aeneas was a Trojan prince and son of the goddess Aphrodite. When the Greeks invaded Troy, he was fighting for the Trojans and he fought bravely. But after the Greeks set fire to the city, Aeneas knew it was time to get out of there. He abandoned his dying father, King Priam, and rushed to help his pregnant wife Creusa. They ran through the burning city looking for their son, Ascanius, but they couldn't find him anywhere. Finally, Aeneas left Creusa with some old women and told her to take care of their son while he went to look for some food. But when he returned with the food, he found that Creusa had been killed by a falling roof beam. Devastated, Aeneas ran into battle to get his mind off his grief. He fought so fiercely that the gods had to intervene to keep him from being killed. After the battle, he returned to the city and found young Ascanius alive and well. The three of them then fled to the coast, where they met up with some other Trojan survivors. Together, they sailed away from the doomed city, leaving behind the burning ruins of Troy. But it wasn't long before a storm scattered their fleet. And when Aeneas came to, he was on the shore of a strange land. This, according to Virgil, was the north coast of Africa, and he named it Libya. There he met Queen Dido and fell in love with her so much so that he stayed in Africa for 3 years and made plans to stay even longer. But the gods had other plans for him. One day, his old nurse reminded him that he had been destined to found a great city in Italy, and she urged him to get on with it. So he said goodbye to Dido and set sail for Italy. When he arrived, he landed in the region of Latium and made an alliance with the local king. Then he led his people inland to the Allia River, where they planned to settle. But the people who lived there, the Etruscans, didn't want the Trojans to stay, so the Trojans and the Latins went to war. Aeneas was wounded early in the battle, and his men were losing badly, until the war god Mars came down from heaven to help him. Mars healed Aeneas' wounds and helped his men win the battle. With the help of the gods, Aeneas defeated the Etruscans and settled in the area, eventually founding the city of Rome. From there, his descendants ruled the Italian peninsula and eventually the entire Mediterranean world. So that's the story that Augustus wanted everyone to hear. A story of divine favor, courage, and success. But there was another version of the story that had been popular since the Republic, and it was a darker, more violent tale that focused less on the founding of Rome and more on how Aeneas got there. This version of the story has its roots in Greek literature, especially the work of the poet Homer. It also drew inspiration from the exploits of real historical figures like the Greek hero Odysseus, whose journey home is recounted in Homer's Odyssey. If you want to hear that story, check out my episode on the origins of Odysseus. Anyway, this darker version of the Aeneas story begins just like the others with the fall of Troy. Again, Aeneas is a Trojan prince and son of the goddess Aphrodite. When the Greeks attacked, he fought valiantly and managed to rescue his father, Priam, and his brother, Cassandra, from the burning city. But although he managed to escape, his adventures were just beginning because as soon as he reached the coast, he and his companions got on their ships and sailed away. Now, according to Livy, the historian who preserved this version of the Aeneas story, there was a violent storm and Aeneas and his men were shipwrecked on the coast of North Africa. Here he encountered the queen of the local tribe, which according to other sources was called the Archaeological. She took pity on the exhausted travelers and offered to help them repair their ships so they could continue their journey to Italy. But once their ships were repaired, Aeneas decided that he liked living in Africa better than he liked living in the war-torn Troy. So he refused to leave. Instead, he married Alyssa and stayed in North Africa, where he lived happily ever after. And that would have been the end of the story, except for the fact that the Romans liked to think of themselves as descendants of the Trojans. And Livy needed to explain why the Trojans never made it to Italy. According to Livy, Aeneas had a son with Alyssa, and when Alyssa learned that he was planning to leave her and go to Italy, she begged him not to go. But he was determined to make his way to Italy. So he left her behind and got on a ship with his father and his half-brother, Cassandra. The brothers sailed for Italy, but Cassandra got distracted by the island of Sicily and refused to leave. He decided to stay behind and rule Sicily, while Aeneas continued on to Italy alone. And that's why, according to Livy, the Italians have no share in the Trojan bloodline because Aeneas never made it to Italy. But wait. We're not done yet because the story gets crazier. Remember that Aeneas was supposed to be the ancestor of Romulus and Remus, legendary founders of Rome? Well, there's a small problem with that because according to Livy, Romulus and Remus were descended from King Nu, who was the brother of King Aemilius of Alba Longa. Now, if you want to hear the story of how Romulus and Remus founded Rome, check out my episode on the legend of the founding of Rome. Anyway, in that episode, I talked about how the Alban king Aemilius feared that his nephew, Numitor's son, was plotting against him. So he ordered the boy, whose name was Aeneas, to be exposed to the elements on a riverbank to die. But he was rescued by a she-wolf, who then suckled him along with her own pups. This is where Livius' account of the Aeneas story comes in handy, because he provides us with the missing link between these two versions of the story. You see, Livy tells us that this Aeneas, the one who was raised by a she-wolf, is actually the same person as the Trojan prince Aeneas. So it seems that Aeneas fled to Italy with his father and half-brother Cassandra, and then later went back to North Africa to live with his mother and half-sister Lavinia. Sometime after that, he went back to Italy and became the ancestor of Romulus and Remus. In other words, there were two different Aeneas. There was the heroic Aeneas who escaped from Troy, traveled to Italy and founded the Roman dynasty. And then there was the rustic Aeneas, who was raised by a she-wolf and became the ancestor of Romulus and Remus. The idea that there were two different Aeneases is actually pretty similar to the idea that there were two different Romulus and Remus. For more on that, check out my episode on the legend of the founding of Rome. So those are the two legends of how Aeneas escaped from Troy and made his way to Italy. The Augustan version emphasizes Aeneas' courage, piety, and good fortune. Meanwhile, Livy's version emphasizes the violence and chaos of the Trojan War and the difficulty of the journey to Italy. Which brings us to our final question, which is what really happened. Well, if you ask me, I think both stories are based on the exploits of real historical figures. The only problem is that the further we get away from the fall of Troy, the more myths and legends get piled on top of the historical core. For example, we know that the city of Troy was probably destroyed by invading Greeks, but we don't know anything about a great war between the Greeks and the Trojans. And the names of the Greek leaders, such as Achilles and Ajax, appeared to be literary creations by the poet Homer, who was writing centuries after the events he describes. Likewise, we know that a group of refugees from the Eastern Mediterranean made their way to central Italy sometime around 1000 BC, and if Virgil's story is to be believed, these refugees spoke Latin, worshipped the gods of the Alban kings, and descended from the Trojan royal line. Unfortunately, we have no evidence outside of Virgil's pages to support any of that. In the end, all we can say for sure is that the Aeneid is a piece of propaganda commissioned by the Roman Emperor Augustus to promote his divine right to rule. Everything else is a myth. Next, we will talk about Romulus and Remus, which follows the story of the myth of Aeneas. See you soon! I hope you have enjoyed so far. Please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thank you.
The story of Romulus and Remus, the founding of Rome, is one of the most famous myths in all of history. Did it really happen? That's what we're going to find out today. It's me, Nelson. Welcome to our channel. Today we're going to be answering the question, did Romulus and Remus really suckle at the breast of a she-wolf? We'll also explore who the twins were, what their origin was, who their parents were, where they were raised, where they spent their childhood, where they gained their fame, and finally, why they are so important when recounting the origins of Rome. So grab yourself a cup of coffee or tea and let's get into it. Now, it's impossible to talk about the legend of Romulus and Remus without first discussing the details of the story itself. As most people know it, it goes something like this. Mulius, the king of Alba Longa, forced his daughter Ilia to nurse her twin nephews, Romulus and Remus. After their mother, Rhea Silvia, was turned into a goddess for having conceived them by Mars, the god of war. When Amulius gave the order to kill the boys, one of the servants carried them away in a basket down the Tiber River, where they eventually landed near the Lupercal cave. There they were found and suckled by a she-wolf, a female wolf who took care of them until a shepherd named Faustulus and his wife, Scalarentia, discovered them and raised them as their own. In due time, Romulus and Remus grew to manhood and, wanting to honor their true parents, killed Amulius and set their mother, Rhea Silvia, on the throne of Alba Longa. Soon after, they left to seek their own kingdom, and after many trials and hardships, they arrived in the region of Latium, where they decided to build a new city. But soon, they began to quarrel over which of them should rule over it. Their disagreement led to a fight, and in a moment of anger, Romulus killed his brother, Remus, and became the sole ruler of the new city he had helped to create. He named it Roma after himself and established its institutions, customs, and laws, with Remus's spirit forever haunting him. This story is probably the most well-known piece of Roman mythology. It seems almost unbelievable that anyone would ever doubt that it's true. After all, the legend has been known throughout Europe for thousands of years, told and retold by everyone from Ovid to Shakespeare to Dan Brown. But as fantastic as the story is, scholars have always struggled to come to terms with some of its stranger elements. For example, in what ways might a she-wolf have cared for infants? Would a wolf really risk her own safety to feed a couple of human babies? And is it believable that two men could have founded the whole city of Rome? To answer these questions and others, we must go back to the beginning of the story, to the she-wolf herself. In classical times, the story of Romulus and Remus went through many different versions. The earliest written version comes from the 1st century BC Greek writer Dionysius of Halicarnassus. According to his account, Romulus and Remus were not abandoned by their parents, but rather rescued by a she-wolf, after a group of soldiers tried to kill them. This version is much closer to the original Italian folklore tale and doesn't include any mention of Amulius or Ilia. Later writers such as Plutarch, Gil, and Livy combined Dionysius's version with elements of other local legends to create the version most commonly known today. These later accounts included more detail about the characters in the story and expanded upon the timeline, adding in the characters of Amulius and Ilia, and giving the twins a more direct connection to the founding of Rome. Of all of these versions, though, the story that has captured the popular imagination the most is that of the she-wolf suckling the twins. According to the historian Livy, after being abandoned near the Lupercal cave, Romulus and Remus cried out for their lost mother. Their wails attracted the attention of a she-wolf who lived nearby. Though she was initially hesitant, the wolf eventually warmed up to the twins and began to nurse them, along with her own litter of puppies. One day, while she was out hunting, the wolf encountered a shepherd named Faustulus. He and his wife, Scalarentia, took one look at the wolf with her two baby humans and assumed that she had stolen the boys from somewhere. Since the wolf seemed to be acting maternally towards the infants, however, they took pity on her and decided to raise the twins as their own. Although the story of the she-wolf is often presented as fact, the truth is that it's only a myth. In reality, wolves don't typically interact with humans in this way, and there's no evidence that any wolves have ever taken care of abandoned human infants. But this detail aside, the rest of the Romulus and Remus story may actually have some basis in reality. Recent archaeological discoveries in the area where the legend takes place seem to show that there was a small settlement near the spot where the twins are said to have built Rome. And according to legend, this area was once part of the Etruscan kingdom of Alba Fusans. We know that the Etruscans were ruled by kings until around 509 BC, when the Romans overthrew their monarchy and established a republic. Historians believe that this event may have inspired the story of Amulius's overthrow in the Romulus and Remus's legend. We also know that the Romans were originally an Italic people, a group of Indo-European tribes that lived in central and southern Italy before the Roman Empire fell in 476 AD. The Neuro became extinct during the Middle Ages, and today, no one is sure what happened to them. But historians think they may have assimilated with other Italic groups, or possibly with the Etruscans themselves. So just who were Romulus and Remus? If they weren't the legendary founders of Rome, were they real historical figures? Well, there's some evidence to suggest that the Romans themselves didn't think so. According to Plutarch, the ancient Greek biographer who wrote the first major history of Rome, the people of Rome weren't even sure if Romulus and Remus were real people. He writes that some believed they were descended from the gods, others that they were born of mortal parents, and still others claimed they were foreigners who came to Italy from another country. The idea that Romulus and Remus were descended from the gods is almost certainly a reference to the traditional story of their birth. According to that tale, Romulus and Remus were the sons of the war god Mars and the Vestal Virgin Rhea Silvia. But the second possibility, that they were born of mortal parents, may have been based on an alternate version of the Romulus and Remus story. In this version, instead of being the sons of a god and a mortal, Romulus and Remus were simply the grandsons of King Numator of Alba. They were the sons of his son, the usurper Amulius, who was killed by Romulus and Remus when the twins reclaimed their grandfather's throne. As for the third possibility, that Romulus and Remus were foreigners who came to Italy from another country, recent discoveries may have provided us with an answer. Thanks to DNA analysis, scientists now know that the Romans were not native to Italy, but migrated there from what is today Greece and Albania. Some historians have suggested that the story of Romulus and Remus may have originated with a group of Nereic people who migrated to Italy and adopted the name Romans after their supposed founder, Romulus. The fact that Romulus and Remus were twin brothers is also interesting because twins are often associated with the divine. In ancient Rome, if a set of twins was born to a woman who had never given birth before, she was considered to be a virgin, even if she had no memory of being deflowered. The cult of the Dioscuri, a pair of twin gods whose cult may have been brought to Rome by the Argives in the 8th century BC, was particularly popular. The Dioscuri, who were sometimes depicted as identical twins and sometimes as fraternal twins, were associated with fertility, and the worship of fertility deities was a common feature of early Roman religion. In conclusion, although the story of Romulus and Remus suckling at the breast of a she-wolf is probably not true, the twins themselves may have been real historical people. If they were, they probably didn't found Rome on their own, but were simply part of a larger Nereic migration to Italy. Over time, their deeds were embellished and exaggerated, and eventually the stories of their birth, their upbringing by a she-wolf, their founding of Rome became fixed in the popular imagination. Despite their mythical status, though, Romulus and Remus remain important figures in the history of Rome. They embody the spirit of the city and its people, and have inspired countless works of art throughout the centuries. Thank you so much for watching today's video. I really hope that you learned something new and exciting. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned. I'll be launching my social media and website in the near future, and would be delighted to connect with you there. Thank you so much again for watching, and I will see you next time.